So I'm going to go ahead and do a share my screen. And right now you should be able to see our home web page. Okay. With our home web page, I want to just bring attention. The focus today is a little bit on the lesson plan templates and the questions you have. It is an expectation, regardless if you're a history ed major or not, but for our history ed majors, to use the templates that all of our department uses. So whether you're in Dr. Fredette's teaching controversy class or this class or the 3626, it could also be world economic history. It's all the same lesson plan template. So I know some of you didn't know what to do and might have used a different version, and that's fine. But for your next update, please use the one that we have. And the way you access it is you go to our project resources link. And then that should open up this page. And what you want to do is we have two templates. The history education majors, you'll be using this version. And the non-history education majors, you'll be using this version. And so if you used a different template or you've already turned in your work, thank you. Don't worry about doing anything extra. I'll give you feedback over the next few days and kind of give you next steps with when I want to see the next version of this template or this lesson plan, presentation plan. So these are the two versions here. And if you click on this first one, it's going to kick you out to our history education resources page. And that's where the templates are at. And what you want to look for when you get to this page is in this first section, curriculum forms and templates, go to the one-day lesson plan template. Okay. And it's going to open up after it asks you to make a copy, it's going to open up to this template. So I'm going to keep this tab open just for a second. For those of you who are not history ed majors, you're going to be using this presentation plan template. Again, if you click on it, it's going to ask you to make a copy. So go ahead and make a copy. And it'll open up as a Google Doc that you can put on your Google Drive. Okay, so just make sure you're logged into your correct Google account. Okay. Again, if you have a question, I'm going to trust on Olivia to moderate the chat or just unmute yourself. But because right now I'm in a different view and I can't see the chat room very well. All right, so let's just go over this template, and I'm going to be just clicking between the two tabs. For those of you in the education version, you need to identify which is your course that your lesson is going to be tied to. So if your research is related to early American history, then that'll be American History 1. If it's something more modern, 20th century US, American 2, and if it's world history, just world history. You may not know what the unit name is, but definitely put in your lesson topic. So if you're doing, for example, rock and roll music during the Vietnam War era. Okay. So you could just do Vietnam War and music or some title for your lesson that you're doing. As far as your instructor, how would a future high school student call you? Put that in there. And as far as dates, don't worry about it too much, but it would be helpful to kind of think about maybe drawing on your high school memory when approximately a lesson like this would be. So like Vietnam and World War II would probably be in a spring semester, April. You just make up a date somewhere in April. It's not early in the semester, so just try to approximate some date just to make it kind of look official.
So I got a question here. Yeah. A question in the chat about turning in the assignment.
Yep. So I see it. Thank you, Olivia. So if you've already turned in the first project draft and didn't have the lesson plan, I do want to see the lesson plan, and that's the extension that I'm moving forward with. So if you've done the project, if you could over the next few days, just even if it's very quick, do a mock-up of the lesson plan template and get it to me I'm trying to just be reasonable and flexible with this. What I was saying earlier was that for those of you who did turn in a lesson plan template but didn't know what you were doing or use a different template, that's okay. I'll just give you feedback, and then the next time we do a revise, you can go ahead and do it right. I haven't given any feedback. I haven't looked at these. I've looked at them, but I just haven't typed them up yet. So I will give you some feedback as you begin revising your templates and your projects going forward. Okay. So let me close this out. All right. So this is the top row, and you'll notice that what's different for the presenter, for those of you who are not history education majors or public history or just the regular BA or College of Ed major, you could use the education one. But if you're not in education, what I'm asking you is hypothetically, where would you present this presentation? Are you thinking this is in a museum setting, a national parks? Are you working at a historic site? Are you working with a specific group? So sort of an idea of where the location or site of the presentation would be. Again, the topic is just what the topic is. Presenter, again, you could just put your name. And then the date's not necessary. You could just put in a date somewhere. It doesn't really matter. So that's just the modification I made there on that row. For the next two sections, we want to make sure that every project that you do has a focused objective, like what you want people to get out at the end of your lesson or presentation. So you want to write that in this section and then align it to a standard. So for those of you using this presentation template, you could just put participants will be able to, and then give me the objective that you want them to learn in that session with you. You could phrase it as a question, and that's fine too. And I'll show you some examples in a little bit. And then as far as the standard, I'll talk about that in just a second. So I'm going to move over to the education version. And for those of you in education, you should have by now been taught at least somewhere in the College of Ed in some pre-class how to write an effective essential question or objective. I'll just summarize it this way. It needs to be one clear target and written in very simple language. The objective is not for students at a high school level to be able to master like big language and wordy statements or questions. Just make it simple, like why did or how did the Marshall Plan help improve the economies of Western Europe? Like really direct, really to the point. So try to avoid any ands or buts or ors in your question. So not like, how did the Marshall Plan rescue the economies of Western Europe, and how did it improve political relations between the US and NATO? And like, you just need one target, okay? So that goes for both presentation template and lesson plan, but just have one clear target, simple language as a question or as an objective, okay? So that's that row. And if you have questions, I'll show you again some samples in a little bit. Okay, so for standards, those of you using the education template, you'll need to have clearly a content and one content standard and one skill standard, okay? So for your content standard, that will come from the essential standards for North Carolina. And for the skill standard, it'll come from the C3 framework, dimension 2, or from the first essential standard in what's written. So I'm going to show you what those standards look like to everybody, okay? Because those of you in public history and the regular BA, multidisciplinary, you'll want to pull from standards, but I'll just kind of simplify it as well. So when we go to our project resources page on our website, where your templates are at, if you scroll down, you have links somewhere. Should have, oh yeah, they're right here. For the C3 framework and for the essential standards for World, American 1, and American 2. So this is where you get them at, okay? So if you just scroll down, past Zotero support, this is the next section. And this is where you'll find the links on our course website. And what they look like is this. This is the North Carolina standards. And I just pulled up American History 2, okay? So when you click on it, it'll look like this. And you'll go to the standards. If everybody wants a skill standard to be the focus, like you should be able to understand what historians do with maps or with interpretation, then you go to Essential Standard 1 for skill. So you notice here that Essential Standard 1, AH2.H.1.1 is to use chronological thinking to interpret data presented in timelines and create timelines. So if you're doing like StoryMap.js or Timeline.js or some tool like that, that's your perfect one. So you just put AH2.H.1.1.2 and then just copy and paste that standard and the number into this row. Okay? Let me know if I'm going too fast, by the way. For those of you in the education template, this would be where you can draw your skill standard from. Okay, so any of these four and their substandards. So that's one place you can get it at. The second place you can get it at is through our, if I go scroll down again, the C3 framework for social studies. Okay, if you click on that, this is what it looks like. You'll have dimension 2 for history, geography, economics, and civics. So depending on your topic, you can kind of just breeze through them and see which one of these you think is a really good focus. And what these standards are doing, they're not from North Carolina, they're national. So if you're in public history, for example, and you're working with school group students, you want to know the state standard, whether you're in Oklahoma, South Carolina, or North Carolina. These standards, or these framework standards, are national, and they were basing off of Common Core, but they're really not Common Core. And the idea is, if you're a political scientist or an economist or a historian, what would be the standards that make most sense to you? So for civics, they polled the National Association of Political Science and asked what would be the sort of skills that you would have to have in analyzing civic and political institutions. And they came up with these. They polled the economists and asked them what standards would be important for economic decision making or for markets or the national economy. And they did the same for geographers and of course for historians. So I highlighted in yellow the standard number. So again, if I'm looking at historical source and evidence and I want to analyze or detect the limitations of historical evidence, if you're doing an Omeka project and you go, you know, these are the top 25 items I would need for an Omeka project, but I'm really limited in the historical evidence, then you might want to be making that part of your presentation or lesson and focusing on that particular skill standard, which is D2.HIS.10 and then .912. And the reason is the C3 framework has some for middle grades and for elementary, but we're not dealing with that right now. So you can use this standard, or you can use one of these from North Carolina in Essential Standard 1 for skill. Okay, I'm not getting to content yet, I'm just talking about skill. And you could just copy the entire language of the statement and the number right in here in the presentation template. And in the education one, it would go in the second bullet right in there. Okay, I'm going to pause just for a second and just see if anybody has a question about where to pull a skill standard from, or what that looks like in your presentation, in your project you're doing. Okay, doesn't sound like anybody has a question. I hope that you guys can follow along. You can give me a thumbs up, that'd be good. Appreciate it. Thanks. All right, yay, got some thumbs ups. All right, so the second bullet in the education one is content. It's really nice to be able to analyze different perspectives or how to detect bias or point of view in a document. But if you don't have a content background, it's really hard to know how to practice your skill. Likewise, you can know all about the Korean War, but what do you do with that knowledge? Do you just become sort of like somebody to go on Jeopardy and just learn all this trivia? You've got to be able to do and apply it into some regard. So that's why the skill standard is important. So for the education folks, I do expect one content standard and one skill standard, because I want you to be familiar with both in the standards for teaching high school. For public history, you can choose whether your lesson has more of a content focus or more of a skill focus. Okay, so even though here it says what's the skill, if you think your project makes more sense to have a content focus, you can do that. Now for that, we would have to use only the state standard in North Carolina. There's no national content standard. So the way you find them is if you go to your project resources and go to any of these three, World History, American 1 or 2, and it opens up, you want to go past Essential Standard 1, and all the content standards begin with numbers 2 through 8. Okay? So if you look at Essential Standard 3, and let's look at specifically 3.2, how environmental, cultural, and economic factors influence the patterns of migration and settlement within the US since the end of Reconstruction. So we're looking at Reconstruction to the present, patterns of migration and settlement. So we could talk about Dust Bowl and migration of people, during the Great Depression. We could talk about westward expansion and the gold rush, but beyond the gold rush, the lands out west. We could talk about land grab from Spain in the Spanish-American War, Puerto Rico, Guam, etc. So those would fit under 3.2 because the focus of this class is American History 2, since Reconstruction. If you look at American History 1, the standards are exactly the same, but instead of saying since Reconstruction or since the end, it'll say up to Reconstruction. But the standards are pretty much the same, okay? It's the World History one that looks different. So you want to look at these standards, and the one here is kind of broad, and then the clarifying objectives get to very specific elements of them. So another good example is if I go further down to like number 7, understand the impact of war on American politics, economic, society, and culture. And then now specifically, since Reconstruction, we can look at particular wars. So if you're doing anything with World War II, this one talks about the impact of war on society and culture. So then you would talk about Japanese internment or Japanese American internment. But if you're doing the Korean War or particularly Vietnam, then you could talk about the civil rights movement, protest movements, things like that, okay? So that would be 7.3. So you, again, copy and paste the number, and then copy and paste the standard, the language of the standard, into this section here of your lesson plan template, okay? And that's how you do that, okay? So I'll just pause again just for a second, see if there's any questions. While I wait for that, I'm going to pull up a couple examples from students in the past and share that on the screen in a second. So let me go to this one. So you should be able to see an Adobe PDF now. And I'm going to just try to make it a little bit bigger. So here's from a student, I think he's student teaching right now, looking at America's westward expansion, US History 1. And so the standard, he actually went ahead and just pasted the general overall standard. But then specifically, he has 3.2 pasted in there. And the question is, who were the main groups that migrated west? And what were the main factors calling them to go westward? So this is fine, but it's got that and. So you want to have one clear target. So you might want to be thinking about how you can grab both ideas and just making them into one statement. If you look at the second half of that statement, what were the main factors pushing and calling them to go westward? In order to answer that, you have to know who the main groups are. So it's kind of implied in that second part. So one thing that I would focus, if I were to rewrite that question, is what were the main factors pushing and calling specific groups to go westward in the United States? And then when you answer that question in the activity or the lesson, you'd have to detect who those main groups are.
There's a question in the chat.
Yep, thank you. So yeah, Sebastian asked, we have to give you a skill and a goal. If you're a history education major, yes. If you're not, you can do both, that's fine, or you could just pick one. I'm not trying to overwhelm anybody, particularly since for some of you, this is the first time you've ever done something like this. In this case, he is a history ed major, so he should have had both. And I don't remember how long ago this lesson was posted, but that might have been a fix I did the last time I taught the class, or a clarification based on lesson plans I saw. So back to the essential question, that would be one. So that's one from a history ed major. Here's one from a non-history ed. This is a public history major. The site's a location's a museum. Be better if you could just make up a museum. The topic's the 14th Amendment. Participants will be able to analyze documents and period materials to understand how meanings of words and text change over time. I think that's a really solid objective. I know there's a couple of ands. So if there's a word or a phrase that you could use that embodies both documents and period materials, great. But if not, that's okay, because it's basically primary sources. And then the second part, to understand how meanings of words and text change over time. I think you could just use text and that would cover words. So how the meaning of text change over time would be enough. That's the only fix I would make to that one. And this student chose a C3 framework objective from civics based on the 14th Amendment. So it was more of a political slant. So it made sense to pick one from civics. Okay, so I just want to show you an example of these. And what I'll try to do, I'm going to minimize this one and go back to the other screen. And what I'll try to do right after class is over, I'm going to go to our project resources page, right where these standards are at. And right underneath Bloom's taxonomy, I'm going to put a link to both of those documents so you can see them. I'm not saying they're ideal, perfect lesson plans, but they give you some samples of what students have done in the past. So I'll leave that up there on our course website. So for the vast majority of you, the next part is going to be the same, but the big difference was up here and what you're supposed to kind of be doing. This is sort of the modifications. So as we go into the second part of it, which is the actual activity you're trying to do, or the presentation, I'm going to start off with our public history, BA history, and multidisciplinary history students. There are 6 sections here. And you notice that I basically just changed the language around. Lessons became presentations, students became participants, so that it makes a little bit more sense to you. But the idea is basically the same, which is how do you hook and introduce your presentation? How do you get people within the first 5 minutes to really perk up and be interested in your talk or your demo or whatever you're doing? How do people acquire new knowledge? Is it hands-on? Is it lecture? Is it a mix of presentation, oral presentation with hands-on projects? How do you see people getting an idea of how to learn new knowledge through the project you're developing? Okay. Then, how would you get people, your audience, to work in groups? Now, that's going to be a little bit tricky because if you're in a museum or national park or historic site, some physical place, that's easy. You can break people up into groups. You can have them do specific elements working with this social media app. That, for example, if you decide to do something with an app, then that's easy. But if you're thinking that the entire presentation is going to be virtual and online, as we're finding out, that's a little bit harder to do in group practice. So you have to be kind of creative of how you would design something that would get people to practice with each other in small groups, to see if they understand the objective for this presentation. I'm going to skip the blue row. And then the next one is, how do you get people to practice on their own, to see if they really understand what you're trying to present to them through this digital tool that you've developed or this digital platform. And then finally, how would you bring the presentation to a close? Okay, so in this hypothetical 1 hour, which I recommended, a 1 hour museum presentation, how would you use the first 5 minutes to hook them? And how would you use the last 5 minutes to kind of put it all together for them in a way that makes sense? Okay, and then then the 50 minutes that remain would be sort of in the middle, your acquisition, your group practice, and your individual practice type of thing. Two things I want to mention. Number one is, you may not always have an individual or group practice. So if you have a second group practice, just copy this part and then paste it in this area and just say group practice number 2. You can do that. Maybe you want your acquisition to come later. So this is a table, and you can delete this row by just sort of like right-clicking or going through the menu features and deleting that row, and then adding a new row between these two, individual practice and closure. So you can manipulate this table to make it the order of activities that you want. So if you don't have an individual practice, that's okay. If you don't have a group practice, that's okay. I think it'd be hard to skip the acquisition, because there's always a point where you, the historian, is presenting something to an audience, right? So those are the 6 sections. And what you want to do in this column is provide as much detail, and kind of read the prompt here. Just kind of delete this, but follow these directions. Be explicit so any colleague of yours can effectively conduct your presentation. So if you designed a 1 hour presentation for an assisted living community that's doing a field trip to your museum, and then you wind up getting sick that morning, and one of your colleagues worked with you on developing things, how could they pick up this plan and be able to then deliver the presentation effectively? So make sure you provide all the details, steps, materials, prompts, anything that you think somebody would need to do in this column. And then in the next column, why are you doing it? How does this activity go back and address the objective you've designed for this presentation or this standard? Okay, there's got to be a reason why you're doing it. It's my whole point. And if I move over to history ed, it's the same thing. Pre-lesson, acquisition, group and individual, extending and refining, that sort of education lingo, and closure. And then here, be as detailed, not long, you don't have to be long, but be as detailed as possible for a substitute teacher or somebody else who is going to come in and teach the lesson for you if you're out that day. And then here, in this column, explain how each one of these activities aligns to your essential question or your content or skill goal. Okay, so just follow these prompts up here. For teachers, it's not going to make your lesson any longer, but I would shoot for 90 minutes instead of 60 minutes. In most public history settings, a presentation is probably about 45 to 60 minutes, is about as long as you can keep a group's attention. But if you're teaching high school, most likely you'll be on a block schedule, so you'll be doing 90 minutes. However, there are some schools that are on the 180-day calendar, and that would be about 55 minutes for a lesson. Okay. But again, both the history ed majors and the non-history ed majors, you can, not your pre-lesson or your closure, but the areas in the middle, you can adjust them any way you want to make sense for the lesson or presentation you're doing. And for both groups, that blue row is just sort of like, if things go wrong, if something happens, what are some adjustments you would make that could help audiences, whether they're students or the public? What if they're moving too fast? What if they're confused? What if the group is a group of tourists from Japan who maybe English is good, but it's not as strong? So just be creative in thinking about a specific problem and how you would try to make an adjustment for it. And that's what that blue row section is for. Again, I went over a lot, so I'm going to pause real quick and see if people have questions. You can unmute yourself if you just want to speak up, or you can use the chat room. Yes.
There's a question in the chat.
Yep, Glenn, that's a good question. You can move your blue row all the way to the bottom. That is not a problem. My main thing is that your first activity should be the hook, in your case, and the last one should be the closure. Even if you move that blue row below closure, that's okay. But what you're saying is that my presentation begins this way and it ends this way. For history ed majors, you could also move the blue row down there, but I think there's something about keeping it in the middle, because every day, from my experience as a high school teacher, every day there are things that just happen in the classroom you sometimes plan for and sometimes you don't. And you have to kind of be ready with what I always call the back pocket trick. Like, if everybody's moving too fast, what is a new wrinkle that I can throw on the activity to challenge them a bit more? Or if it's too difficult, what's a way that I can slow things down and re-explain it for them? So I think there's a value of kind of keeping it in the middle, just to mentally prepare yourself that things sometimes may go unexpected in a classroom in the middle of class. But you can move it to the bottom too. It doesn't really matter. Good question. Any others? All right, since we just have a few minutes here, I'm going to try to keep these sessions not the whole 9:30 to 10:45 of our class, just 10 to 10:45. I just want to explain to you the last part of this template and then what to do afterwards. Regardless of what your major is, you should have some way to check whether you feel like people are getting it. Like, do I see that my audience is really understanding what we're doing here today? That would be formative assessment. It doesn't, when we talk about assessment, it doesn't always have to be like a quiz or a test or something, very formal. What formative means is building. How do you know? How do you see that people are getting it, basically? And then the other one, how do you know that people got it at the end? Okay. You may not have one or the other, and that's okay. But be thinking about ways that inform you as the presenter or as the teacher, how people are getting it, where their challenges might have been, so that the next time you do this particular lesson or presentation, that you feel like you learned from this presentation and you had enough data to prepare you for the next one. So an example here of formative assessment could be a quick survey. You can use like a doodle poll or some sort of, and ask people in the middle of your presentation at your museum, okay, so far, what have you got? And go to this app, scan this QR code. If you got a phone, you can do this in pairs if you want to, if somebody doesn't have a phone. And I want you to answer these quick 5 questions. Or you can just do it in paper and pencil and say, I've got a quick survey. This is like the midway point of my presentation. I'd like to see what questions you have or what comments. Just fill out this form. I'm going to pass around the pencils and the sheets of paper, and then we'll resume the second part of the presentation. So just something like that could be in the middle, and then, or an exit survey or exit ticket out could be the summative for those of you who are not in education. You'll notice if I go to that template, it's the same language. Okay, formative assessment, summative. For teachers, how do you know the middle class students are getting it? Again, there's a lot of tools that are available for you. It could be just what I explained now, paper, pencil, could be a doodle poll, could use plickers or clickers or something like that. You can have people put Post-it notes on the whiteboard. Just be thinking about how you can get students to help you. And then at the end, same thing, like how did they learn? What did they learn from the lesson, et cetera. And I think that for both of those types of assessments, it's important for you to kind of know in order to prepare your next lesson or how to teach this the next time, but also try to design something that lets people know whether they're getting it or not. So it should be just as useful for the audience as for the presenter, okay? And then finally, materials and supplies. What are some very specific materials that you need for your presentation. Do you need a projector? Do you need a series of tablets? Do you need markers and post-it notes, like easel size post-it notes? Do you need a series of photographs? Just be thinking about those, and you can just enter them there and hit enter, and it'll open up another bullet, and then you can just keep doing that as well. And then finally, the last section for everybody is the same thing. This lesson plan is a paper that you're writing for a history class. So give me your works cited page, basically copy and paste them in there using Zotero if you want to. Create your bibliography, paste it in there. What sources informed you for your content, and what sources did you get for giving you ideas of how to use this particular tool in the classroom? So even if you're using like Timeline.js and you can't find any good articles about how to use Timeline.js, you might find on the internet ways to effectively use a timeline activity with audiences. Then cite that. It could be a blog post, it could be a journal article, it could be a book, just something that shows that this is where I got some of my ideas from, and this is where I got my content from. Okay? The notes itself, you can leave blank, but for history ed majors, I think it's always good that after you teach a lesson, at the end of the day, just leave a few notes for yourself on how things went, so that the next time you teach the lesson, it's there for you. But for this class, there's nothing needed in there unless you really want to make some notes for yourself. So I just went over about a minute, but I want to just pause again and just see if there's any more questions about the template. Okay. Obviously, you can feel free to email me questions that if you forget after we finish here. But I'll just mention that if you turn in your lesson plan template and you didn't know what you were doing, that's okay. I'm going to give you feedback. Don't feel like you have to resubmit. If you use a different template version, I don't know where you got it from, but if you got it from somewhere else, this is the one you need to do next time when you revise. And if you did not attach a lesson plan, that's okay. I'm not going to count it late, but please get it to me as soon as possible because we've got other deadlines coming up. Those deadlines are on our course website, and we'll have this calendar here, but I'll try to update you as well. So our next sort of official one would be related to Omeka and digital storytelling on March 27th. And let's try as much as possible to kind of hold to these deadlines as much as we can, but I'm going to give you some flexibility with the one that was due before the break, just to make sure you get any part in. I don't want to penalize anybody for, including myself, for what these last few weeks have been. This video will be on YouTube sometime this afternoon. Zoom makes it really easy for me to record this and then upload it to YouTube, and then I'll send you the link. So right now, actually, I'm going to stop recording this session. And end it there. So good question. Any other questions?
Quick question.
Yep.
For the submission of this, do you want us to do the blog post, or do you want us to send it to you via email?
The submission of your lesson does not need to be a blog post. I think one or two of you did. That's fine. I'm not going to ask you, but I would prefer that you send me the lesson plan via email. And in the lesson plan, you can have links to the projects or products that you've created, or you could just put the links in the email itself. As long as I can find it in the email or the lesson plan template, I'm good.
Excellent. Thank you.